welcome to the next session, The Great Reconciliation, Economic Rescue and the Climate Imperative, moderated by Tom Nuttall.
Thank you. So in this brief and fully virtual panel, we're going to be discussing the interplay between climate change and the coronavirus pandemic. Here in Europe, we often hear that a good crisis should not be put to waste. And one striking element of the recovery plan that was agreed on a few months ago is that it builds in targets for climate-friendly spending. 1/3 of the funds that will be borrowed by the EU starting next year will be devoted to green causes, and some of the national stimulus packages, we see something similar there. But clearly, the pandemic has gobbled up some of the political energy that might otherwise have been devoted to climate change. Most tangible example is the postponement of COP26 in Glasgow, which will now be held next year. Outside Europe, it's not always clear that a sense of climate urgency has been maintained. And so I'm hoping that the three guests that we have here can help offer us some perspective, both on what's happening in Europe and outside. We have three of them all joining virtually. First, His Excellency Mark Brantley, joining online all the way from St Kitts and Nevis, where he is the Foreign Minister. He's also the Premier of Nevis. From the US, Rachel Kite, who is the Dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Before that, held a number of senior climate and sustainable energy roles at the UN and the World Bank. And a late addition to the panel is Martin Hojcik, who's a Slovak member of the European Parliament for the Renew Group, who also has a long history of environmental involvement and activism. So just to check with our panelists, can you all hear me okay? If you can give me a signal that you're locked in, you can hear okay. I think that's 3 out of 3. Minister, maybe I can start with you. You can offer us some perspective from the Caribbean. My understanding is that St Kitts and Nevis has handled the pandemic fairly well, although I imagine the blow to tourism has been significant. Perhaps not, though, quite the existential threat that climate change might pose. So can you offer us some thoughts on what impact the pandemic has had on climate change and climate diplomacy?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing me to be a part of this panel and a part of this global discussion. It's a very important and timely discussion. You are correct, St. Kitts and Nevis has handled the pandemic fairly well, given our size and our resource constraints. We've only had 19 cases, 18 of whom have recovered, and none have been hospitalized, and certainly we've had no deaths. So we are very grateful for that. You asked a very important question because, of course, climate change does represent an existential threat for most of us in the Caribbean. Many islands and countries in the Caribbean are low-lying, and as a consequence, even a nominal rise in ocean can result in those islands essentially disappearing. We're also in our region very heavily dependent on tourism. And most of our tourism infrastructure, our hotels, are naturally along the coastlines. That's where the beaches are. And so they too stand to be decimated. This COVID-19 pandemic has really, in a way, showed us what that can look like, because since March 25th of this year, our borders have been closed. They remain closed in St. Kitts and Nevis. Throughout the Caribbean, there's been considerable dislocation as a result of COVID, and tourism has essentially disappeared for most of us. We're hopeful that it can be restarted, but how it's going to look is unclear at this point. What I will say to you is that as certainly someone in government, and as a small government in a small island developing state, it has been very difficult maintaining focus on climate issues with the health threats posed by COVID. And I think that that is part of the problem and why I'm so excited to be here to get ideas from and a sense of what has been happening elsewhere, whether or not the political capital for climate change and the impetus that we had going back to the Paris Agreement, whether or not that can be sustained as countries now with scarce resources direct some of those resources naturally to the fight for health and safety in relation to COVID.
Thank you very much. Rachel Kite, maybe you can offer some thoughts on precisely that. As I understand it, in one of your previous roles at the UN, you were looking specifically at the link between climate and sustainable energy on the one hand and poverty on the other. What's your sense of how the pandemic and its consequences, its impact on poverty, have affected the interplay between those forces?
Well, thank you, Tom, and it's lovely to be with you all today. I think next week we will have the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, and in a speech yesterday, Kristalina Georgieva, the managing director of the IMF, sort of hinted at where they're coming out with the World Economic Outlook in terms of the impact on growth. But I think that what was clear at the General Assembly just a couple of weeks ago is that we're talking about 100 million people being pushed back into poverty that have climbed out over the last 20 to 30 years. And so I think that as we think about building back better and using the dislocation of COVID-19 to try to, move our economies forward on a better pathway towards decarbonisation, that has to be an inclusive pathway to decarbonisation. So we are going to have to focus on the justice and the equity within the economy. Before COVID hit, the big discussion topic, for example, at Davos in January was inclusion, and the fact that a lack of inclusion within economies and between economies is corrosive for growth. And so this Build Back Better conversation has to be one which makes us more resilient sort of socially and from a position of equity, as well as from a position of sort of the carbon within our growth path. And I think that that's complex. I mean, for most decision makers, they're looking at short-term decision making about incomes and jobs and how to move away from this extraordinary sort of global recessionary moment, and thinking about where the sweet spots are, where you can build more jobs, have those be jobs in sectors which will be growing and cleaner for the future, but also build that inclusion and resilience at the community level in. I think that this is the task in hand, and I think it's complex.
Thank you. Martin Hojcik, Europe likes to see itself as in the vanguard of the fight against climate change, and certainly with the recovery fund that climate-friendly goals have been built into this very specifically. We have a bit of a scrap now over carbon reduction targets for 2030. Can you give us your sense of whether you think that the EU is doing enough, not only in terms of the EU's own emissions, but also when it comes to what you might call climate diplomacy, dealing with the Chinese, dealing with America?
Thank you, Tom. First of all, I also am very grateful for the opportunity to be part of this panel. And I want to say that I don't think Europe is doing enough, because we always can do a bit more. But are we doing a lot? Yes, I think we are. I believe that the recent announcement from China is also thanks to the help of diplomacy from the European Union and its member states, and that we are pretty active on the international scene. Now, besides the diplomacy, I think we need to be clearly leading the way. And today, I'm very happy to say that the European Parliament approved in the plenary the 60% goal for 2030. So it's a very clear position that the Parliament wants us to lead the way. But we need to also put the money where our mouth is, and we need to also make our finances fully in line with the goals on climate.
Okay, we lost your last sentence there, but I hope you're still with us. If you can, are you still with us? Okay, I'm not sure if you. Yes, you are. Okay, good. Sorry, I think we're having some problem with the connection there. You mentioned this rather unexpected pledge from China the other day. to work towards carbon neutrality. And there seems to be quite a lot of disagreement in the global climate community, if I can call it that, on exactly how we should interpret this. I wonder, Rachel Kite, if you can offer us some thoughts on the significance of this pledge, not only whether it means it's going to, if this is good news as we try to stick within the limits in the Paris Climate Change Agreement, but also what it should mean for the Europeans, for the Americans, for the partners of China working towards those goals.
Well, I think it's absolutely good news. Does it mean that every detail of how China will achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, and does it mean that we know every detail of how they will peak their emissions early? No, but I don't think that that should be what we expect. The direction of travel is very clear. The announcement was very clear, and now the detail on that will get filled in by those who have to figure this out in Beijing. I think it's also very good news because it signals the race to the top between China and Europe. That obviously there are all kinds of complexities in that around trade and around the sort of frosting over the relationship in other dimensions. But this is important, and then it sends a very clear signal to the United States that there is a race to the top now. And the debate in the United States about the fact that the Paris Climate Agreement and the targets set within it and the targets that have to be superseded now because we know so much more from the science, that the message to the United States is, that this discussion in the US that somehow Paris was punitive and that economic growth and development would suffer in the United States, that this is absolutely wrong. And I think you're starting to see some policymakers really beginning to turn their head now here and say, oh, wait a minute, we need to be in this race and we need to win this race. And therefore, I think that having both China and the EU in September come out with aggressive targets does sort of change things a little bit. Also, it changes it for Boris Johnson.
Oh, we've lost you. We can't hear you. The moment you mentioned Boris Johnson, your mic got cut off. I won't draw any conclusions from that. But I hope we can get the connection fixed and come back to you. But in the meantime, I'll go back to the Minister. Minister, from your perspective, I assume you're not particularly bothered about where the cuts in emissions come from, whether they come from China, whether they come from Europe, whether they come from America or anywhere else. You simply need to get those emissions down and you need those Paris targets to be met. So from your perspective, as a Minister of, in a country that faces a bigger risk than almost anywhere else in the world from climate change, what's your assessment of the state of climate diplomacy today? As we were hearing from Rachel, big pledges from the EU, big pledges from China. We'll see what happens in America after the election. Give us your take on how climate diplomacy is proceeding today.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. I'm speaking from a region that is perhaps one of the most vulnerable regions, the Caribbean. I've said, gave a speech at the United Nations national statement a few years ago, and I said that in many respects, our region was being asked to cash a check it did not write. We are among the most vulnerable, among the most affected by climate change, and yet we are low emitters. We have not contributed to this problem in any significant degree. Those that have contributed significantly to the problem, what we find is that there is a tremendous level of talk, there's a tremendous level of academic armchair discussion. We don't have that luxury in our region because we truly have an existential threat and the whole civilizations, the Caribbean civilization, could be wiped out. We have the real risk of climate refugees and people having to relocate to find other places where they can live. And so for us, oftentimes when I listen to debates about pledges and many countries and regions talk about how much they've committed to climate change and climate change funding, the question that I often ask is how much of that funding has actually reached its targets, how much of that funding has actually been deployed to assist. And I'll give you an example. Here on the little island of Nevis, we have a geothermal project. Geothermal as a renewable energy can provide all, 100% of Nevis's power needs and potentially all of St. Kitts and Nevis's power needs. We also have the potential to export power to neighboring islands. What the problem has been, we cannot find the financing to develop this particular project because many are saying that it's too small, it's not commercially a project that would attract commercial attention. These are some of the realities that we face. So what I want to see is a move from just the rhetoric and the talk and a move towards on our hands anymore.
Okay, we got most of what you said. Your last sentence was cut off, but I think the message was pretty clear. Just assuming that your connection is back, you said enough talk, time for action.
Yes.
COP26 has now been delayed until next year. I know that some people think that this is a blessing in disguise, that actually we weren't ready to have the conversations that needed to take place then. Now we have a little bit more time to prepare for them. I don't know if that's a view that you share and what you would like to see result from that discussion next year.
I don't necessarily share that view. I understand it because certainly the world has been preoccupied with the COVID-19 pandemic. But I don't necessarily share the view because I think that each day of delay is a further causes further detriment to our environment and to our world. And so we have to now think if COP26 has been always going to be delayed for what does that do in terms of Paris agreement? We also get
We're losing you again, and we're not having much luck today. You're a long way away.
I'm hearing you clearly. I'm hearing you clearly, but for some reason you're perhaps not hearing me.
You're back now. You're back now. Please finish your thought.
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to say that 5 years on after the Paris Agreement, clearly we are now through the first phase. We really are anxious to get to implementation, and a delay, even for a day or a month, or a year, as in this case, is, in my view, very dangerous for our climate and for our civilizations.
And Rachel, before you got affected by the Gremlins, I wanted to ask a follow-up question specifically about the United States, which you were starting to discuss. We have a rather important election in a few weeks' time. Climate change perhaps hasn't been at the forefront of the debate in the United States, but certainly for a lot of America's partners, very much including the Europeans. The prospect of a Biden administration is something that they look forward to, at least with a sense of optimism that it might be possible to fold America back into the global conversation on climate change, most obviously getting America back into Paris. Can you offer us some thoughts on where you think the American debate is? And if we do see a Biden administration, whether we will see a renewed American commitment to the global push against climate change?
Yes, well, while climate might not be the first issue for every voter, it is an issue in the election, and you have a stark contrast. You have a real choice. You have an incumbent who doesn't believe that it's really happening or that there's much that humans can do about it, and that it is potentially damaging. Action to prevent it would be damaging to the US economy. And you have Joe Biden with a $2 trillion sort of package, which is comprehensive. It was the Jay Inslee package that became the Jay Inslee Elizabeth Warren package that became the Biden package, impacted by young people and the Sunrise Movement and the extraordinary movement that's going on here. So if Biden were elected, you would immediately see climate diplomacy taking place to the extent that it is allowed for before January, and then Biden would take over in January. You would have the US back into Paris, and you would have then furious diplomatic activity related to the UK leadership of the G7 and to the UK hosting of COP26. And the point I was making before was that the Chinese and the EU ambition gives a glide path and a landing path for Boris Johnson. And I think that the UK, the higher levels of the UK government were a little adrift in terms of what was the landing pad for COP26, but I think that they now have some wind in their sails. So stark contrast on November 3rd, real choice. The US, I think, will be back in a traditional leadership role if Biden wins.
Thank you. And Martin, I think we have you back now. I want to ask you a question specifically on the interplay between the recently agreed recovery fund and climate-friendly spending or climate-friendly investment in the EU. 1/3 of these funds are meant to be devoted to climate-friendly projects, climate-friendly investment, whatever that means, and presumably designing the methodology for that is going to be absolutely crucial. Can you give us a sense from your point of view, from the point of view of the European Parliament, how are you going to ensure that that pledge that we heard from President von der Leyen a few weeks ago is actually going to be actionable and is going to have a meaningful impact on greening our economies, our energy systems, and our infrastructure?
Thank you, Tom, and I hope the connection now works, because I think the important part agreed a system of rules, and the connection is quite. Oh God, can you hear me?
We didn't hear very much of that, but give it another try.
Okay, let me try to. Okay, let me picture. We have of rules that it's taxonomy of green.
It's we're not getting enough of you to be able to make it out. I'm afraid. I don't know if our team can do something to try to get us a stronger connection. It's a shame. Rachel, I don't know if you have. I know you're sitting in the US, but I don't know how closely you're following the European debate. But this was one of the more sort of dramatic moves that we've heard as part of this European Green Deal. This attempt to ensure that vast amounts of the monies that are going to be borrowed by the EU are devoted to climate-friendly projects. Do you have any thoughts on that and the best way to design such schemes so that the pledges are turned into something actually meaningful on climate action?
So the very important signal from the Council, from the Commission, you've got the Parliament now upping the ante, and then you've got some very important signals coming out of the European Central Bank as well. And I think this is really where both finance ministers at the member state level, central bankers, and then the ECB have to be really clear that we can't be sort of market neutral. If we know that carbon is bad and that we want it out of the economy, both in the terms of the European economy and in the role that Europe plays in supporting low-income countries, then there should be a preference. There should be a preference in green bonds. There should be some instructions that you shouldn't be holding carbon. So if we're going to move carbon out of the economy, we're going to have to use every fiscal and macroeconomic tool available to us to do that, because we have to get half of the emissions out this decade in order to hit mid-century goals. So I think that that's just sort of, it's, as I said, it's game on. There's a lot of sort of engineering underneath the hood, as it were, as they would say in the side of the Atlantic. And I think that that's beginning to happen now. So no time to lose, because time is the one thing we don't have the luxury of, but time for some real engineering here.
And where are the lowest hanging fruits here? Because I'm based in Germany, and there was as I'm sure you know, there was a big climate package at the end of last year, which came in for a lot of criticism. One of the criticisms is that the government pays too much attention to the car lobby and doesn't do enough on transportation. More broadly, I mean, there's lots of things that we can do. We can look at infrastructure, we can look at transportation, we can look at energy, we can look at heating, we can look at agriculture, the list goes on. When we're thinking about, particularly as you said, we need to get half of those emissions done this decade in order to meet those targets, where should we be focusing our energies? There are big trade-offs here. What should we be focusing on?
Well, so the energy transition has to keep pushing forward, and so that's complicated politically in some member states, but economically it is not very complicated at all now, honestly speaking. And then transport, there's still a lot to do, and I think we're waiting to see big announcements from trucking. I think that could be something that then is sped up by government policy. We're seeing shipping and aviation. I think aviation is something which is going to be very complicated and where there's still more work to be done. And then I think we get into making sure that all of the, there is a leading edge of cities, right? How do you make other cities sort of catch up, and what's the support to them? And that's the built environment, heating, etc. And then there's a very complicated package about land use, right? But some of the new technologies, making sure that green hydrogen and green ammonia is really a big part of European future. These are things which can be supported, and regulatory policy can make that go faster. But it's don't do stupid things in energy. Let's clean up the pieces of the energy transition that aren't moving as quickly as others. And I think that we start to make a difference.
Okay, we'll go to get some questions in a minute, but Martin, we can't see you, but I'm told that we can hear you. So I don't know if you wanted to have a second go at answering the previous question.
I very much hope so, and thank you for the opportunity. We have agreed in the European Union a set of rules about what is green investment. I had the honor to be part of the negotiating team, and it's called taxonomy. And I think this is very important tool that can be applied not only to the financial sector, but also to the public finances, because it helps us to set what actually the climate-friendly investments are. And we have a very good tool for benchmarking these, and we have to align recovery package, we have to align our public spending way more with the taxonomy, but also encourage the financial sector to use it and invest into not only mitigation, very important, the sinking of the emissions, but also adaptation, because the climate change is already happening, whether we want it or not.
Thank you. Okay, we'll go to questions. There are three ways to deliver them. There's a few of us in the room here. People watching online, I think there are some of those are able to send us questions via the stream on the website. And then there's a group of people who are able to submit questions over Zoom. I'll start and see if we have any questions in the room here. Don't see any. Okay. I think, yes, over here. I think you need to come to the mic here, please. And if you can tell us who you are.
Hello, my name is Edith Bátorfi, International Visegrad Fund. A question, in a certain discussion round just a couple of weeks ago, I heard that because of the general lockdown of the economy in March and April, we contributed to the reduction of CO2 by 40% of the general goals. So how you would comment this situation? How far we have to reduce our capacities in the industries and the economies? What measures we have to take in order to relocate or shorten the value chains in order to reduce the general, let's say, output, especially in the CO2? Thank you.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand the question, are you asking what lessons have we learnt from the experience earlier this year when we saw a certain decline in emissions as a result of declining economic activity?
Yeah.
What lessons does that teach us for more broadly how we're going to put ourselves on a sustainable path towards a reduction?
Exactly. We had a complete lockdown, nothing worked.
Yeah.
So it was a tremendous reduction of all sorts of activities, transport mainly.
Yep.
And we saw really fantastic, spectacular pictures over Europe and generally over the earth, cleaning the air and so on and so forth. So, I mean, this was quite a wake-up sort of approach, and I'm asking how far we are ready to go.
Yes, okay. I mean, I think we probably all agree that economic lockdowns are not the way to achieve our climate goals, but I don't know if any of our panelists want to jump in on that.
If I may,
Please,
I would just say that yes, we saw dramatic reductions, but that came at a very steep price. And most countries saw tremendous economic contraction as a result of the lockdown. So I agree with you that that cannot be the answer. We have to develop strategies that allow us to lower emissions without the corresponding draconian economic lockdown that we've seen. I wanted to go back, though, to what one of the fellow panelists was saying in relation to the US elections. And the irony for us in the Caribbean is that we are out of time. We are in the most vulnerable situation. And yet we find ourselves almost dependent on the electoral processes in the United States of America as our largest neighbor, most populous neighbor. The situation that we face is that if the Americans tomorrow were to vote one way or the other, that has implications for our very survival insofar as climate change is concerned and the approach that we've seen there. We see major countries such as the United States, Brazil is another example, where the attitude towards climate change has shifted based on the philosophy of the incumbent of the day. And the question that we must face is, can the region, which is most significantly impacted, endure another 4 years of climate denial, climate change denial, and another 4 years of the posturing that we have seen? Can the Paris Agreement survive in its current form without the involvement of a significant country such as the United States of America? From our point of view, we see what Europe is doing, and we're very impressed with the leadership that Europe has taken. But certainly for us geographically, the United States and what happens there is of a special relevance. And so these are some of the concerns that we have, where an issue which ought to be global in nature and is global in nature, which ought to be driven by science, oftentimes gets derailed because of national political agendas or national political policy in some of the countries of the world. And that is why I think when China speaks, we must welcome its approach. We look to see what major emitters such as India and others will do. And I think that Europe is doing a good job in providing leadership in this regard.
Thank you. I think, Rachel, I think you wanted to jump in. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think His Excellency is absolutely right. The injustice of this is stark, and it's also stark in the age of COVID, because what became as a health crisis, mainly in the geographic north, right, and then became an economic crisis, a financial crisis, started off in many low-income countries and developing countries as an economic and financial crisis, and then became a health crisis. So I think in terms of what have we learned, well, energy demand collapsed. It showed that the renewable energy can actually be more resilient, which I think is an important learning. Secondly, we learned that as we all go back to work and the lockdown eased, then energy demand went up again, and so emissions have gone up. So we've learned that this is a systemic issue. It isn't just about individual choices. So voting matters. We've learned that we can't self-isolate from a pandemic. We can't also self-isolate from climate. It is global. We've also learned that some other parts of the economy are not very resilient as well. For example, the food systems, which don't get talked about a lot, but we need food systems that work for both the planet and for human health. And they were severely disrupted as a result of the lockdown. And I think we learned something about resilience there. But the most important thing, one of the most important things is that public attitudes around being resilient locally, about the importance of local as well as global, have shifted a little bit. And the public attitude around climate change has not diminished because there was a pandemic. And I think that's very important, because now a lot of the climate action will have to be embedded in recovery packages. And if the public is saying, we want to be better prepared for climate impacts, then I think that will help stiffen the resolve of policymakers to make sure that those recovery packages are green.
We have a question from, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing this wrongly, Mate Veres, about nuclear energy. Europeans, as we know, are heavily divided on this. In Germany, where I'm based, the withdrawal from nuclear power has left the energy system worryingly reliant on coal, which is fast disappearing from the energy mix of other European countries. I mean, maybe one for you, Martin, but of course our other panelists might want to jump in as well. What should be the role of nuclear as we try to reduce the emissions coming from the energy sector?
Well, from my point of view, the nuclear power has disqualified itself by being not a viable economic alternative. When you mention Germany, yes, there is a nuclear phase. There is a massive growth of renewables as well. Actually, they are catching up on the out of the coal. And if you compare, for example, the level of phase out of coal in Germany, which is also phasing out nuclear, and in Poland, which doesn't even have nuclear, I think it's clear that the Germans are managing. It's about political will. You can be personally anti-nuclear, you can have either opinion, but at the moment the economics is very straightforward. It's not an economically viable alternative. It takes too long to build, and the renewables have become way cheaper. So why to actually even bother?
Do our other panelists have thoughts on that?
Well, certainly for us in the Caribbean, nuclear has never...
So we'll take the Minister
Sorry,
first,
go ahead.
and then we'll go to... The Minister, please.
Yeah, I was just saying, for us in the Caribbean, nuclear has never really been an option. We have, however, other alternatives. We, of course, have a lot of sunlight, a lot of sunshine in the region. That's an option. Many of our islands are volcanic, so geothermal energy is an option. And some of us have explored wind energy as well. We, of course, are surrounded by ocean, and so wave energy is also an option. So we have various options for renewables, but I would not anticipate that nuclear would be one of those in our region.
Rachel.
I was just going to add that I think the point around just the planning time, as well as the points about the economic viability, are important when you think about how we need to drive the energy transition forward, this decade and into the next one. Having a 20-year sort of planning cycle it sort of takes it out of the equation. I would have to say, though, in the US, and not just in the US, but there is a lot of excitement around fourth generation thorium and fusion and some of the other things which every few years get press releases. And there is some serious R&D money, private R&D money going into that. But I think each country's risk appetite is different. And those shift, by the way. I mean, Japan shifted its attitudes, Germany too. But at the moment, with the price and the competitiveness of geothermal, of modern renewables, wind and solar, these are attracting most of the attention.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions in the room here? Over here. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Katrina Kirtisova, and I'm a policy fellow at the European Leadership Network in London. My question concerns transatlantic cooperation on climate change, and in particular subnational climate efforts. So we know that over the past 4 years, collaboration with the federal government, the US federal government, on climate issues has been lukewarm, but subnational climate cooperation has really blossomed, and these subnational actors have been able to take the US partly towards the target it has set under the Paris Agreement. And I want to ask you, if Joe Biden is elected in November, what are your expectations of what will happen with these subnational efforts if for example, EU partners decide to focus on engagement with the federal government instead? So where do you see the subnational climate efforts going under a prospective Biden presidency? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. Who wants to start with that?
If I may open,
yeah.
First of all, I would say that let's hope for the best and be ready for the worst. Okay, I think that we need to maintain the networks in either case. And we definitely need to work on having the collaboration on the federal level with the US government, and keep on trying to talk in with the current administration, whether it's desperate or not, but also work with state actors, work with municipalities, and also I think business sector is in this case really, really important actor. The money that the businesses can mobilize, the money that they can direct towards green investments are immense. And I think this is something where we in Europe, but also all the other countries, need to collaborate with the, let's say, like-minded alliances, like-minded actors in the countries where the administrations in place are not climate positive, let's say.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask one final question to all of you, really. And it comes from a conversation I had recently with a friend of mine who's running for the Bundestag in Germany. And she told me that when she was out and about talking to people on the street, to voters about what it was that they cared about, climate came up again and again and again, perhaps more than anything else other than COVID. But then she said when she asked people what they wanted to do, or more specifically what they thought that she should do about it if she were to be elected, she said that they didn't have a clue for the most part. And sometimes we do see that concerns about climate change, which people are happy to express in opinion polls in the abstract, do not always translate very readily into support for specific actions which some people feel may impoverish them or make their life more difficult or inconvenience them in some way. So I'd be interested in thoughts from all three of you on exactly how we can channel what is clearly a growing sense in the abstract that more needs to be done on climate towards concrete actions that may be harder to implement. And Minister, let's start with you.
Well, I think that your colleague is absolutely right in terms of her observation, and that is why I say that we really need to move this from purely an academic discussion to real tangible results on the ground. Many people talk about it. Climate change has become a buzzword, a buzz phrase, I'm sorry. The question, however, is what are we actually doing? What is happening on the ground? I think the fact that she has most of her voters or potential voters do raise climate change perhaps points to the success of public education on the matter in terms of bringing awareness to our populace. And certainly in our region, we have issues, training in the schools, we have constant reinforcement of the issues. Many of the countries are doing things like banning plastic, styrofoam, and there is, of course, a great interest in moving towards a green economy in terms of energy in particular and renewable energies. So work is being done. But you're absolutely correct. How do you translate that into the households and at the grassroots level to have people understand that it is not necessarily a trade-off, that you can achieve improvements in relation to our climate and our environment without necessarily sacrificing the quality of life that people enjoy. In fact, some may argue that if we can solve this climate issue, we will enhance immeasurably our quality of life. And so I think that that's a very fair observation. It's one, as a politician myself, that I have made here in our region, that there is talk, but how do you get that talk translated into actual results on the ground is sometimes a bit difficult.
Thank you. Rachel.
Well, I do think that there's a generational shift, and I think young people, it's not that young people see sacrifice in a different way. I think young people understand that there is something exciting about being able to have a clean and green world and sort of reset that. But what they want to know is what is the career pathway, what are the jobs, and you know, where is that going to come from? But so I think that selling this as actually being something that's better for everybody, that you can aspire to, you know, prosperity, and that we can have clean air, and we can have you know, more investment in the resilience at the local level is an important pivot that started to take place. But then we have to actually make it easy. So you can't tell people to compost and then not make that available at the community level, not make that affordable. You can't tell people that they should have, you know, solar home systems and then make it very difficult to find the contractor that's going to be able to do that and take the rebate away. So I think that it's the ease with which this is just sort of accessible, and I think we're getting there, but this needs to be completely doubled down on. And then I think there is a question of solidarity. There is no way that we do this without bringing everybody along. We can't leave people behind. And so there has to be a conversation about solidarity and its value in the developed world, because there's a duty of care that we owe to those who did nothing to cause this problem and who are suffering the most. And I think young people get that differently as well.
Thank you. That's a perfect jumping off point for you, Martin. You're an elected politician. How do you see this playing out?
And I agree with the both speakers. I would use combination of two words: climate and justice. I think you, Rachel, already mentioned it, and this is very important about how we do things. That the way we change the course, the way we actually prevent the worst is by not bailing out big corporations, but by really helping people, changing the system, by helping people to have higher energy efficiency of their homes, by providing them with sustainable transport infrastructure and opportunities, by making sure that actually there are conditions for green innovations, that there are opportunities for people to come up with innovations, that there is a conducive space for new businesses, and at the same time a safety net which doesn't leave people behind. And I fully support what Radecha said about also global justice. We have to, it's not only North and South, I think this North and South, we have globalized the rich and localized poor. That's the sad reality. And I think we need to make sure that we are looking and how to close this social divide as much as possible, because that makes the whole system inherently unstable. So by bringing justice into the climate solutions, I think people will be on board and will be very eager to be part of it.
Thank you very much. I think that pretty much wraps it up. We're out of time. Thank you to all of the panelists, and particularly thanks for bearing with us through the many Zoom gremlins that decided to descend on us today, but I think we got there in the end. It was a great discussion, so thank you very much indeed. And to our audience here, in 5 minutes, we'll carry on with a discussion on the impact of the American election in Europe, which we discussed a little bit in our last discussion. And in the other room, we'll have an online interview with the EU's first chief prosecutor. So thank you very much. Thank you to panelists. Thank you to the audience.
Thank you. Thank you.